This time it's the Norton Commando Story. Before we start, don't forget to like and subscribe, it really does help us create future content. Norton Motorcycles was founded by James Landau Norton, aka Pa Norton, in 1902, and right from the start the company was synonymous with motor racing, with Rem Fowler taking victory in the multi-cylinder event at the first ever TT in 1908. But while this machine used a Peugeot-sourced V-twin engine, Norton itself was much more famous for its single-cylinder racers. Initially with side valves, such as the famous Old Miracle, a machine which held multiple world records in the years before World War I. This would be replaced by an overhead valve unit, which would evolve into the ES2, a machine which remained in production decades after its first design. In racing, the overhead valve would in turn be replaced by the single overhead cam International, and this too would be superseded by the dual overhead cam Manxman, an engine which when fitted into the McCandless frame would be the ultimate racing Norton. However, Edward Turner's Speed Twin had changed the direction of the British motorcycle industry. In short, if you didn't have a parallel twin, you weren't relevant. And so it was that Norton introduced their first parallel twin engine in 1948, and this was the 497cc Model 7. Early machines used plunger suspension, which in combination with a rather stiff road holder front forks could make for a rather harsh ride. This would fairly quickly be replaced by a swinging arm frame version, which was at least a little easier on the rider's spine. But it wasn't until the advent of the McCandless featherbed frame that the Norton twins really came into their own, giving rise to the classic Dominator. The first Dominator used the 497-500 engine for the Dominator 88, which would quickly be joined by the 597cc Dominator 99. The early Dominators were renowned for their fine handling, and with the arrival of the 650SS in 1961, they now had the performance to match. The 650 had a 647cc engine with a bore stroke of 68 by 89. Compression ratio was 8.9 to 1, and claimed peak power was 49 horsepower at 6,800 rpm. There were twin carburetors, and the machine made use of a 4-speed AMC gearbox, although the overall gearing must have been fairly high, because the highest one-way speed on test was 118 miles an hour, with a 111 mile an hour average. Either way, these were pretty big numbers by mid-60s standards. The twin-carbed engine had many features in common with most other parallel twins then available on the market. Unusually, Hotwood mounted the camshaft at the front of the cylinders instead of the rear-mounted camshaft of the BSAs or the twin cams of the AMC and Triumph designs. But the bike wasn't perfect. The primary drive cover was a pressed steel affair and prone to leaking, and worst of all, the bike had a bad reputation for vibration. This was something which was made worse by the way that people rode it. It was a sports machine, and the young riders treated it accordingly. One interesting side note of the Dominator family was the Domi Racer. This used a tuned version of the 500 engine with competition spec cycle parts. The machine was conceived to provide the clubman racer with a much more affordable package than the overhead cam singles. Back in the early 60s, Norton had already begun development work on a replacement for the Dominator series. There was a unit construction overhead valve engine and the somewhat awkward looking dual overhead cam prototype. Unfortunately, by this point, AMC, Norton's parent company, was already in financial problems, and this would affect Norton in a number of ways. The axe would fall on the racing programme, and the new engine designs would not pass the prototype stage. Norton, it should be noted, was still profitable at this point. Unfortunately, all the profits that were made were used to prop up the ailing AMC concern, and this would lead to the cancellation of Norton's much anticipated new manufacturing facility. The Bracebridge Street factory was closed, and Norton's assembly line was moved into the AMC Plumstead factory. And this period would also see the final development of the Dominator family, and this would be the 745cc Atlas. Indeed, the Atlas was faster than the old 650SS, but there was a trade-off. The larger engine gave the bike a more top-heavy feel, and worst of all, the vibration was a real problem. And in the long term, Norton knew they were going to need something more sophisticated. Now the Atlas, like the rest of the Dominator family, made use of the featherbed frame. Now the featherbed frame is many things, but one thing it certainly isn't is any damn use off-road. And this presented an obvious solution for AMC. Simply bung the Atlas engine into an AMC frame. The result was the heavyweight desert racer, the P11 Ranger. And while this period would see some weird mixing and matching of engines with Norton engines and AMC frames and vice versa, the Ranger is perhaps the best of them and is an undeniably handsome machine. But of course the Ranger did not fix the Achilles heel of the Dominator engine. How could they stop the thing from shaking the bike to pieces? The obvious engineering solution would be to fit a balance shaft. But this was the mid-60s and there was certainly no cash for an all-new motor design. Because by 1967 AMC was gone and Norton Villiers had risen from the flames of what remained. And so in 67, Dr. Stephen Bauer, formerly of Rolls-Royce, AMC's Bob Trigg and Villiers designer Bernard Hooper began work on a completely new chassis concept, one which isolated the engine, gearbox and swinging arm away from the rest of the frame via isoelastic mounts. The resulting machine was first shown at the Earls Court Show in 1967, and this was the Norton Commando. The first machine featured truly modern, up-to-date styling. It included a seat which blended into the fuel tank and a neat fiberglass tail section. The engine was now inclined in the frame to help cure some of the top heaviness of the earlier Atlas. One controversial feature was the new tank badge, on which Norton Villiers had expended an awful lot of cash employing a London agency to do the design work. However much they'd spent, the management weren't especially happy with the results, and in particular the reaction from the general public to the design. By the time the bike had reached full production, the very expensive badge had been dropped. The Commando was an immediate success, and shortly after launch the Fastback was joined by a more conventionally styled Roadster and a police version called the Interpol. For the American market there would be a truly bizarre style cruiser, as well as the rather more beautiful Commando S with its high-rise exhaust. On the road the Commando continued with Norton's tradition of excellent handling, despite those isoelastic mounts, just as long as they were set up properly of course. The motor was of course an evolution of the Atlas engine. It was of 745cc with a bore and stroke of 73 by 89. There were twin 30mm AML concentric carburetors, and the bike ran a compression ratio of 8.9 to 1. Claimed peak power was 58 horsepower at 6,800 rpm, with the bike reaching a measured top speed of 117 miles an hour in 1968. 1969 would see the final closure of the Woolwich factory, with production of the Commando now moving to the Villiers factory in Wolverhampton. Although frames were made at Reynolds Tubing in Birmingham, and some assembly was done at Andover too. But a combination of worn out machinery and the constant movement of the production line did adversely affect build quality. Despite this, the Commando remained popular, winning MCM Machine of the Year and enjoying strong sales throughout the late 60s and into the 70s. But there would be some improvements too in the move. Points were moved to the end of the camshaft, and the previous sand-casted rocker covers were now given a polished finish. It was evident from launch that the new machine would have potential as a production class racer, and so a machine prepared by Paul Dunstall and ridden by Ray Pickerel was entered into the 1968 production TT. The machine would go on to claim a first time out victory in the 750 class. This would of course be excellent publicity for the factory, and perhaps even better publicity for Paul Dunstall, who would build an excellent reputation supplying tuning parts for Norton Commandos. Back on the road, 1970 would see the introduction of the Commando Mark II, which featured a range of minor improvements to the chain guard, levers, side stands and switchgear. 1971 would see the introduction of the Mark III. This features new upswept exhausts with reverse cone and megaphone silencers. 1972 would see the introduction of the Mark IV 750, which featured a disc brake as an option. This was also the year that saw the bizarre High Rider, and the first introduction of the Interstate with its vast fuel tank, which held 25 litres or 5.5 imperial gallons. That's 6.6 tiny American ones. But this was also the year that saw the introduction of the notorious combat engine in the Commando Sport. Now this motor did give a healthy increase in power, now claiming 65 horsepower, and on test the machine managed a truly stunning 12.1 seconds standing quarter mile. But unfortunately all this power led to premature failure of the main bearings. As a result, some 1500 engines on the production line had to be modified, with lower compression pistons, with improved oil supply, and beefier bottom end bearings. All these changes, plus a number of warranty claims, meant that production of the Commando ground to a halt by the end of 1972. All this would drag Norton into severe financial trouble, and would bring about the forced marriage between themselves and BSA Group in 1973, a marriage which would do neither partner any good in the long run. But 1972 wasn't all doom and gloom, with the John Player Norton racing team enjoying some successes with star rider Peter Williams. 1973 would be even better, with the machine taking 14 victories including the Formula 750 TT. To capitalise on the success, the company would develop a race replica, which was introduced in 1974 and was actually based on the 828cc 850 Mark II. Initial plans had been for 1,000 machines, but ultimately only around 200 were ever completed, making it one of the most desirable Norton Commandos. The 850 had arrived in 1973 and was designed as a more refined version of the 750. The new engine was less frantic, but it also generated healthy amounts of torque, and it was a fair bit quieter too, an important consideration with new European noise regulations coming into force. The Mark II arrived the following year and included only minor modifications, and was followed in 1975 by the 850 Mark III. This was the final iteration of the original Commando. It had improved isoelastic mounts, disc brakes both front and rear, and an electric start. But in its drive to become more sophisticated, the Commando had become much heavier, now 492 pounds or 223 kilos, and was considerably slower, struggling to reach 110 miles an hour. A revised version was designed for the 1976 market. This had fresh styling, including alloy wheels. But unfortunately both this and a prototype fitted with an 8-valve head were both stillborn. In the years that followed, Norton would of course be associated with the rotary engine racers. However, in the 1990s, engineer Kenny Dreer, working in Portland, Oregon, would develop a range of improved components for the Commando engine, culminating in a run of 880cc machines in 1999. Following this, he would begin the development of the 961. This featured a completely new power unit, which, while retaining overhead valves, now featured a 270 crank, so no longer required isoelastic engine mounts. Unfortunately, Dreer ran out of money in 2006. In 2008, the design was purchased by businessman Stuart Garner, although perhaps the least said about Garner the better, a man whose dodgy business dealings once again drove Norton into financial disaster. Indian motorcycle manufacturer TVS swept in, purchased the name, and built a completely new production facility in England. And while some may wince at the idea of Norton being under Indian ownership, the fact is that the now reintroduced 961 is a much better product than it had been previously. I have personally test rode one and found it to be a very nice machine built to a very high quality standard. But the air-cooled engine can't be produced forever. So what's next for the Commando? Well, only time will tell. Whatever bikes or collections of bikes would you like to see us feature in a future video? Maybe you get a bike we can use for a test ride. Either way, do get in touch below. Hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, thank you very much for watching.